Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how things in Montpelier shake out for the rest of us. I want to welcome journalist John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. He's here to bring us up to speed on some things that have been happening across the state. I'm glad you're here, John, even though we may not have a lot of happy things to talk about.
We're just coming off the third July 10th flooding event in 3 years. This one, thankfully, was not as bad as the previous two, but you know, next year in early July, I think we're all going to be looking at the calendar and wondering what's going to happen on the 10th because it just seems to happen over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking this morning as I was getting ready for this show, just how conversations around national natural disasters and flooding specifically have changed since Irene. When Irene happened, yes, there was an acknowledgement of climate change and that there would be more storms to in our future, but there was sort of a sense that yeah, we got to prepare for this, but it's going to be a while before we get another one. It was like this is a 100 or year flood.
Yeah.
We got to prepare for them, but it's not going to happen very often. And now it's like, yeah, it's springtime. We're getting floods, and we're getting massive floods, and the conversation to me has just changed
Yeah.
so much.
And with what's going on in Washington with FEMA, you wonder if we have a backstop anymore, and it's not just like, Trump having revenge on blue states, FEMA fell down on the job in Texas. So
Mm.
it makes you wonder what would happen if we had little to no response from the federal government the next time we have one of these. And, you know, over the last, 12 to 15 years, we have had we are near the top of all states in terms of number of federally declared disasters.
Yeah.
Uh, we, I mean, I remember, when I first moved here, there was a lot of talk in terms of climate change about, the worst thing that will happen to Vermont is that we'll get climate refugees from the coastlines. And so we might have population pressures and all that sort of thing. But it turns out that our topography is kind of a natural for flooding because, we have mountains, we have valleys, and our cities and towns are mostly in the valleys along rivers. And, you get huge rainstorms. I saw rainfall totals as high as 5 inches uh, on July 10th this year. Um, and you get that much water washing down off the hills and the mountains, and you're going to get floods that are going to wipe out, highways and even communities. And, thankfully, as far as I have seen so far, we're recording this on the 11th, um, the damage is not nearly as bad as it was the last 2 years. But, we may be seeing this, we seem to be seeing it routinely already, and it may be only getting worse, and we might be on ourselves without being able to depend on much help from the feds.
Yeah. Well, and I worry that the changes at the federal level are hitting Vermont at a crucial time because most communities have been working very hard to do some mitigation planning
Right.
that FEMA was going to at least partially fund in many cases. And that mitigation planning is really important because that's the planning that makes the bigger culverts and widens the bridges and makes things more resilient when the floodwaters do arrive.
Right.
Um, and so for a lot of communities, that work might actually get halted,
Yep.
depending on what happens at the federal level. And then that just makes us more vulnerable going forward, in my opinion.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. And I don't know. Um, it's one more pressure point for Vermont, and we have a bunch of them.
That's yeah, that's a very accurate and kind of gruesome way of putting it. Thanks, John. That was hysterical laughter, if anyone can't tell. Um, so, speaking of pressure points, let's shift gears to some of the pieces you've worked on this week. And one of them that I knew was coming, and unfortunately, I think a lot of people knew was coming, was the the ramping down of the motel program, and about, was it 800 people
Yeah,
were
800 more or less,
more
including
or
about
less.
100 children,
Hmm.
if memory serves. And a lot of people who are highly vulnerable were exited from the motel voucher program. I heard some pretty gruesome descriptions. If you followed the press coverage of this, a lot of people were exited on July 1st. Um, and if you followed the press coverage of this, you read some really appalling stuff.
Yeah.
A woman evicted from a motel in Rutland who is 8 months pregnant and is trying to work out where she thinks a friend of hers can give her like a junked car to sleep in. And she's worried not so much about where she's going to stay. That's like, well, I'll deal with it. But she's worried about her baby being taken from her after it's born because she's homeless.
Hmm.
She doesn't have shelter. Um, so that's what's concerned her. And I also I read accounts of like people who are bedridden or using oxygen machines or in active cancer treatment, highly medically vulnerable people who
Hmm.
the governor says over and over again that he's dedicated to protecting our most vulnerable. He's not. He's failing if that's his goal. And we had the backdrop to this is he's been complaining about the voucher program for years. Nobody likes the voucher program. It was supposed to be a temporary band-aid. He's been complaining about it for years, but he has yet to propose an alternative to it, or an off-ramp away from it. And he vetoed the legislature's own plan for a replacement for the voucher program without proposing an alternative of his own. Um, so, you know, um, I mean, there are a lot of people and a lot of forces at work in causing this crisis,
Yes.
but he's the one who is not doing anything to solve it. And a lot of people are suffering tremendously because of that.
Hmm.
And if you, among other many other things, you hear a lot of complaining from Vermonters about homeless people and panhandling and vagrancy and litter and all sorts of stuff. This is a direct result of Phil Scott's policies or lack of policies,
Mm.
because that's why there are so many people who are unsheltered in Vermont. Um, So, if you don't feel safe in downtown Burlington or Montpelier or Brattleboro or wherever, you know, ask the governor what he's doing about it.
And just for listeners, I'm watching my friend's dog. So if you're hearing dog noises in the background, like drinking water, that's what it is. Um, well, I was sharing with you some of my frustrations before we started recording today about how I feel like as a state, we put a lot of energy into hand wringing, and
Mm-hmm.
we put a lot of energy into talking about the problems. But when the rubber hits the road to do something, um, plans get scrambled. And you and I talked about a few housing projects, for example, that were scrambled at the local level because someone didn't want their view disturbed, or they were worried that the housing complex would attract the wrong sort of people, quote unquote. Um, And I'm just right now I'm just sitting with that frustration. And it's like, why are we even worrying about the problems if we're not willing to actually fix them? You
Yeah,
know?
you know, Vermonters are proud of their brave little state. In many ways, their pride is justified.
Hmm.
There are many great things about Vermont. But it also creates a certain unwillingness to confront the issues and enact solutions that
Hmm.
may make small changes to the state, to the landscape, to, our communities. They may, in the long run, make them healthier communities, healthier places to live. But in the short run, this field is going to have a solar array in it, or, that corner that is currently, unoccupied is going to have housing built on it, or, you know, um, any one of a number of other things that might need to happen in order to make Vermont a better place for more people to live. And um, at the granular level, at the macro level, we sort of can have very fruitful discussions about the problems we face and what needs to be done. But at the granular level, at the individual level, the town level, um, making change is really hard, and we make it really hard. And,
Hmm.
um, that's, you know, you might make a case, you can make a case for opposing development in some places.
Hmm.
You can't make a case for each and every development proposal, against each and every development proposal. You've got to let things happen somewhere.
Right.
Uh, and I, if like the housing reform efforts of the last couple of legislative sessions take effect and take some of the power away from local boards and put it in the hands of regional boards or even the state, and housing proposals and development proposals start going through more quickly,
Hmm.
which is what we need. Is that going to make people really mad about how things are being done? I think at
I
least
think
some,
there's a chance of that, yes.
yeah. And you know, like I say, you can make a good case for opposing development in many places, and that's why the legislature has tried to draw housing reform in such a way that will protect the special places.
Hmm.
But you can't say no all the time.
Yeah. This conversation reminds me of a essay or an op-ed I read years ago now. It was in the Valley Advocate, which I'm not sure if the Valley Advocate's even printing anymore, out of the Northampton area. But it was written by someone during the time when they were putting some windmills on uh, the ridge line between Wilmington and Bennington,
Mhm.
uh, Searsburg, um, Somerset. I'm forgetting my geography, but the writer happened to be out hiking and stumbled across one of the windmills in the process of being built, and he was just writing about this experience and thoughts on renewables. But the line that stood out to me, and it's what I kind of refer back to when we're having these conversations about community, is they said, the world keeps changing and our energy needs are changing. And so we need to keep moving forward, um, for the sake of our planet. And when as long as we keep moving forward, then something better will come along, and we can take down the windmills if they're not working, and we can put this better thing in place. And it echoes for me about when we get stuck in our communities, about we're trying so hard to hold on to what we have, but it may not be the best thing to hold on to, especially if it's standing in the way of something that could be better.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that doesn't get rarely gets talked about, the renewable energy advocates bring it up, but nobody listens to them. Is, how does it affect our economy that we are sending so many of our energy dollars out of state to
It's a
Canada,
good point.
oil companies elsewhere. Um, how would our economy benefit if we were generating our own power, or at least more of our own power? Um, I don't know the answer to that. I think that the benefits would have to be substantial.
Hmm.
Um, and we have handicapped ourselves pretty greatly in terms of building out local renewables because of local opposition and because the state has been often been an active opponent of renewables. The regulators under Governor Scott have been extremely opposed to renewable development.
Hmm.
Uh, there have been cases where they have overridden local authorities and regional authorities who have said yes. And that's one way in which, yeah, there would be more solar farms and there would maybe be large scale wind turbines, although there haven't been any of those built in Vermont in quite a while, and
Hmm.
there is no development planned as far as I know. But, you know, when I'm traveling elsewhere and I see large scale solar or I see a wind farm somewhere, northern New York and um, elsewhere, I think that that's progress.
Hmm.
I don't think it's ugly. I think it's a lot less ugly than almost any other kind of human development, strip malls or, whatever. So uh, anyway, I think we need to adjust our thinking, and that is a difficult thing for Vermonters to do because we cherish our state so much and we cherish our community so much that we don't make good judgments about what's a positive change overall and what's a negative change.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, John. I would add, just out of sympathy, I do want to acknowledge that I think there are some communities who are afraid of change because change has not always been good for them.
Yeah,
For example, the ski areas give a lot to our economy, um, but they don't always offer the best paying jobs, and there are people who can't afford to live in their communities because the housing prices have gone up. Um, so sometimes development has, in some cases, left other communities behind.
yeah,
And I just think we should acknowledge that as one one of the reasons people might dig in their heels. And then it's beholden, or it's the onus is on the rest of us to really get better at communicating like what change means and why we need it. Um, so I'm just kind of adding that to the table.
yeah. And part of this, I think, also is that journalism needs to do a better job at balancing that out. I see
Yeah, good point.
because I try to read as many of the local papers and things like that around the state as I can regularly, and um, I see the same kind of I see almost a cookie cutter story
Huh.
that I read over and over again about, local opposition to X development, whether it's an apartment building or a housing development or a new road or a solar farm or whatever. Um, and they extensively quote the opponents who are colorful and passionate and clearly care about their communities.
Mm-hmm.
Very little quotation of anybody else. There's very little from the people who are in favor of this idea or development or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very easy way to write the story.
Yeah. Yep.
It magnifies the opposition, who are often a small group of people who are most directly connected to or, most directly affected by the proposed development.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it it kind of creates, to me, a misleading narrative and a destructive narrative in terms of our ability to move forward.
Mm.
It's like You have someone who's proposing some new thing, and you have a group of people trying to protect their community or their view or their neighborhood or whatever. And those people kind of wind up, whether the reporter actually means it or not, they come off as the sympathetic figures. They are the Davids, and the developer is the Goliath.
Right.
And, you know, David wasn't always right, isn't always right.
Hmm.
Um, so, and that's just a bad way of framing things. But I read that over and over again, all over the state.
That is a good point. Thank you, John. Thank you. Um, I'm curious. We have just about 5 minutes left before we need to hear from some underwriters. A brief thing we were talking about, or actually you wrote on your site, was about the campaign finance filing deadline and the amount of crickets that
Yeah,
were all over it.
we have a campaign finance reporting system where during a campaign season, candidates are required to report pretty often, and that's a good thing for
Mhm.
transparency. During the off year, which we are in now, there's only one campaign finance deadline. There's only one between like December of last year and March of next year. And
Wow, I didn't realize that.
it was July 1st.
Okay.
And it went completely unremarked upon in the press. I did write a story about it. To be honest, there wasn't much in the filings, but I thought it was worth noting what happened, particularly in the extremely early stages of the race for governor in 2026. And we don't know how that's going to shake out. We don't know if Governor Scott is going to seek reelection. We don't know who might run against him on the Democratic side. There are rumblings. But what turned out to happen on July 1st is that nobody really reported any real fundraising. Not
Hmm.
the governor, not Treasurer Mike Pichak, who's the most widely considered person, the most likely to run for governor. Nothing from Attorney General Charity Clark or Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hansis. No sign of any activity at all, which I thought was noteworthy because, whoever runs against Phil Scott, if he runs for reelection, and until we hear otherwise, we kind of have to assume that he is.
Hmm.
But whoever runs, if you are running against Phil Scott next time, when Howard Dean briefly considered a run for governor in 2024, he estimated that it would take at least a couple $1 million and probably more to mount an effective campaign against Phil Scott.
And is that because of name recognition?
You're overcoming name recognition. You're overcoming his potential fundraising power, which he
Hmm.
hasn't had to fully exercise, and his ability to dominate the airwaves. When you're governor, you get on TV every time you hold a press conference. You get stories in the papers. Uh, you you have the bully pulpit, and you're the only one. And in order to overcome that kind of advantage in terms of recognition, popularity, and accessibility to the media, you have to have a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Our thought 2 million. I thought there might be, if like Mike Pichak was actually considering a run for governor next year, that he might have raised a few $100,000.
Hmm.
That would have been a sign because he already has enough money to run for reelection as treasurer left
Mm-hmm.
left over from last time because the Republicans have yet to mount a credible candidate against him. Um, so if he had come in with like 200 or 300,000 or $500,000 or whatever, that would have been a sign that he's cooking something up.
Hmm.
But he didn't. He has in fact sort of spent a modest amount of money since last December and raised almost nothing.
Okay.
So that is not, I mean, he is continuing to pay a highly regarded campaign consultant,
Hmm.
to be his advisor and planner
Hmm.
and whatever else. to the tune of about $3,000 a month. Uh, and so he's obviously not, he hasn't like, put the car in the shop and put it up on blocks and all that. He's, keeping it tuned up and keeping the oil changed and all that for a potential race. But there's no sign that he is actively fundraising.
Hmm.
And, again, because of the way our campaign finance law is written, we won't hear anything more officially on campaign finance until next March, which, it's very early to be talking about 2026 right now. It's going to be bordering on really late before we see any official sign of what's going on in campaigns in Vermont.
Right.
So I thought it was worth writing about that. There was nothing worth writing about. Itself was worth writing about as far as I was concerned.
um, and remind me, John, will there be any other filing deadlines? I'm thinking at like the local level, the select, like if someone's running for select board, they have to file with the town clerk by a certain time.
Yeah.
Is there anything on that at the state level? I can't remember.
I mean, there must be. I'm not up on my local fundraising deadlines,
Hmm.
but there must be because it's town meeting. Uh,
Hmm.
so the elections are next March. So there is a separate cycle for that, but I don't know what the deadlines are.
But
Uh,
nothing for the like the governor or the state
nothing
level
for
folks.
nothing for statewide or for legislature until next March.
Okay. Wow, that's a long time to wait.
Yeah.
Hmm.
In my piece about it, I proposed we have a lot of reporting deadlines at the as you approach the election. There's like two in October and one just before the election and one just after the election, and that's a lot of paperwork for candidates. And I propose that we eliminate one of the Octobers, sort of shift the calendar around so that
Hmm.
the October November reporting deadlines are a little more spread out, but still allow for the transparency that you want and add another deadline like in the winter or spring of the campaign year so that we get an earlier read than March for who might be running for what, who's thinking about running for what. But um,
Hmm.
I don't think the legislature is going to listen to me, but stop me from writing about it.
Well, thank you, John. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW LP Brattleboro will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I am your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining me, I am speaking with John Walters, who is the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer. You can find it at the vpo.org. Before we dive back into our conversation, I want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of the show, sharing it with other media centers around the state, and remind everyone that the views and opinions of those on the Montpelier Happy Hour belong to the host and the guests and no one else. So you just send the emails to John and I after you hear this conversation. We'll take rants, we'll take raves, we'll even take compliments if you feel like sending them. So, John, in the first half of the show, we were talking a lot about, communities and journalism and cutbacks to the motel voucher program. And I want to switch gears a little bit to something that was very big in my neck of the woods. And yet you're kind of like, not sure it's as great as we say it was. And that's the new legislation that's removing taxes and the need to pay taxes on military pensions.
Mhm.
Um, Folks in my neck of the woods, Representative Laura Sibilia was one of the people who really kind of has been pushing this legislation for years. There's a lot of people who are very excited about it, saying it's a great way of attracting more people to Vermont, especially workers, because many of the people who retire from the military are still in maybe their 30s, 40s, 50s, and still have lifetime of work ahead of them. But you were saying it may not be as rosy as everyone thinks it is.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it's not worth, honoring our military veterans who have served their country. I have people in my family who served their country, and I
Likewise.
honor what they did. At least, I would have had an uncle, except that he enlisted in the Navy at age 15. He lied about his age and died up on board a submarine during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is not against the military, but a lot of the arguments that have been made about this tax exemption are vastly overblown in my mind.
Mm.
We'll start with a broader point, which is for all the talk about taxes driving people away or attracting people to low tax environments, there is precious little actual evidence that tax policy by itself makes a measurable difference in population
Mm.
or in decisions on where to move. I mean, it's not to say that some people don't move to Florida or even New Hampshire to avoid state taxes, but the number of people who do that, it just doesn't show up in the statistics. It's not a big enough number. The number of people who move into Vermont roughly are equal to the number of people who move out.
Mm-hmm.
Since the pandemic, in migration has actually been higher. Uh, there is no sign. I mean, the most obvious example of that is Vermont versus New Hampshire. New Hampshire doesn't have a state income tax at all. But there is no sign that there is a vast number of people, or even a measurable number of people, who move from Vermont to New Hampshire. It's about even both ways, in fact. So this isn't going to boost population.
Mm.
It might a little tiny bit, probably not enough to offset the lost tax revenue that we are foregoing. Um, and the other thing about this, and I was not aware of this because I am not a veteran,
Mm-hmm.
but I heard about it from Jeff Danziger, the political cartoonist,
Mm-hmm.
is a Vietnam vet. He served for 4 years in Vietnam and wrote a highly entertaining and disturbing memoir of his time in the Army called Lieutenant Dangerous. Um, and he pointed out that, most people who serve in the military never get a pension. The military pension program is only for people who serve for 20 years
Right.
and then retire. So Jeff Danziger doesn't get a pension. My dad didn't get a pension. If my uncle had survived the war, he wouldn't have gotten a pension.
Yep.
The vast majority of enlisted men and the non-officer class never get a pension. Some NCOs get a pension. Almost all officers get a pension if they stay in the service for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't rewarding the troops. This is mostly rewarding the top end of the military that serve for 20 years, and they do make sacrifices, and they could have made more money in civilian jobs. Yes. But, they exit the military usually in their 40s,
Mm-hmm.
with enough time to build a second career, with valuable, highly employable skills, with sometimes with connections from their service in the military and knowing other officers who retire and go to work for a defense contractor, say, or become a lobbyist, or go into politics, or become a corporate executive somewhere. Um, most military pension recipients um, are in the upper tax brackets.
Mm.
So this is largely, as I said in my piece, a tax giveaway for people who don't really need it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that's what you decide to do because you want to honor the troops and you don't want to tax people for serving in the military, if that's how you choose to, frame it, then fine. Most states do not tax military pensions. I've got no real problem with that. Um, but I think a lot of the arguments for it are misguided or overblown, vastly exaggerated. And I think it's not going to make much of a measurable impact in any regard.
Hmm.
We are foregoing a modest amount of tax revenue at a time when the state coffers are really, stretched. Um,
Hmm.
and that's a problem. And then the other thing is, if you want to, and Senator Ann Cummings, who has been an opponent of this tax break for years, her argument is if we want to honor military veterans for their service to the country, that's fine. But is that where we draw the line? Do we make police pensions tax free?
Good point.
Firefighter pensions, um, corrections officers, EMS,
Hmm.
nurses, doctors. Where exactly do you draw the line?
Hmm.
Is this the right place to draw the line? I don't know. It's where we've chosen to draw the line, and we'll move on from here. I just don't want anybody to think that this is going to be a panacea for anything.
Right. Well, and I think we should also add that veterans have other needs besides paying taxes on their pension. There are healthcare needs, there are housing needs, there are, returning to civilian life needs, there's community needs. And how as a state are we caring for those needs as well?
And the vast majority of those veterans are not getting military pensions at all
Right.
because they didn't serve 20 years.
Yep. Well, I appreciate that, John. I One thing I liked about the post you put on your website was it just added more clarity and nuance to the conversation
And
that, wasn't happening.
honestly, why it took me after this already went into effect when we have been talking about this issue for years. And I don't remember anyone ever pointing out that the vast majority of military vets don't get pensions.
Yep. Well, yeah, a huge thank you to Jeff in this situation because it's a great reminder of how as journalists we can only give the community the information we have and why it is important for sources to provide the other their own experience to help us understand the situations better.
And to be honest, there's probably few, if any, journalists in this state who served in the military.
True.
I didn't. When I was of military age, the Vietnam War was going on, and I didn't want to step into that.
Hmm.
Um, but when you have reporters and editors as a class who are liberal arts graduates who didn't serve in the military, then they're just completely ignorant of that fact. And it took Jeff Danziger, who is a liberal but a military vet, to point that out to me.
Hmm. Yeah, I've noticed over the past few generations the two things that have changed so much as far as like lived experience is fewer people in the military, fewer people farming.
Yep.
There was a time in our communities where both were true for a lot of people. They'd served in the military, either even male or female, like as nurses. My grandmother was a nurse in World War II. My grandfather was in World War II. Um, but they were also farmers. And it's interesting how community conversations change based on lived experience like that.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you to Jeff for sharing his experience with you. Shifting gears to Scott Beck. And I'm interested for this conversation. For those who don't know, Scott Beck is a representative.
He's a state senator
Oh,
now.
senator. Thank you. And the reason I'm foggy on him is his name has been dropped to me a couple times, but I haven't actually, he's outside Windham County and I haven't dug into him. But yes, his name comes up again on your blog. So now I'm like, okay, who is this guy? Tell me more, John.
Well, the title of my piece was, Scott Beck may not be the smartest person in the legislature, but he's in the conversation.
Hmm.
Um,
Which is
he,
a smart thing to do. Get yourself in the conversation.
yes, um, he's been in the legislature since 2015.
Hmm.
He's from St. Johnsbury. He and his wife own a bookstore. He is a military vet.
Hmm.
Um, and he served for uh, basically 10 years in the legislature. And then last year, the longtime senator from the kingdom, Jane Kitchell, retired,
Right.
and that opened the door for Scott Beck to run for state senate. He raised a lot of money. He won his race. His Democratic opponent raised a lot of money too. He won the race quite handily. And when I was looking back at some of his campaign materials, I realized that he ran very much as a pragmatist, kind of a centrist who can like work for the people of my district, that sort of thing. Um, he enters the state senate and immediately becomes Senate Minority Leader. That in itself is almost unheard of.
Hmm.
I didn't try to check the history, but it's quite possible that it's never happened before.
Oh, really?
I mean, the Senate is a very seniority laden body. You
Hmm.
know, you tend to get the best committee assignments after you've been there for a while.
Right.
Um, and for a freshman senator, even one who's been in the legislature for a while, for a freshman senator walk in the door and for his Republican colleagues to immediately say, yes, you're our leader, is a remarkable accomplishment in itself. Uh, when Scott Beck was in the House, he was a very respected member of the minority Republicans. He never served in caucus leadership or anything like that, which is a little bit interesting in itself retroactively.
Mm.
But he served for most of his time on the Ways and Means Committee, and which
Oh,
is
right.
writes tax policy. And he was respected as, a lot of the Republicans in the legislature just kind of vote no on everything the Democrats propose.
Right.
He actively worked with the Democratic majority to try to enact, try to get some of his ideas into legislation. And he was a positive force, even though he was a member of the minority party and, often a very tiny minority.
Hmm.
Um, Anyway, he enters the Senate. He immediately becomes minority leader, leading a caucus that's mostly brand new people. The Republicans went from Senate 7 senators to 13. Um, and so he had a lot of new people to herd in the sense of herding cats. And as far as can be told, he did a really good job. He held
Hmm.
the caucus together. They voted as a group. They, had significant influence as a larger minority, on how the Senate did its business and what was considered and what, you know, uh, what legislation it considered and passed. Um, and he was a strong voice for Republican policy. He kind of
Hmm.
became, after Phil Scott, the most prominent Republican voice in Montpelier.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, then, we're coming down to the end of the session. The education reform bill is, the House and Senate are, at loggerheads on what kind of reform bill to pass. The House and Senate form a conference committee, 3 people from each body,
Hmm.
and there's Scott Beck on the
Back
Senate.
in the room.
Got a seat at the table. And actually, he and Seth Bongartz, a Democrat from Manchester, worked very closely together to propose versions of education reform. Both men, we have talked about this before, both men have deep ties to private schools
Right.
that have a lot of, public tuition students in them. And he and Bongartz worked very hard to promote legislation that would protect the interests of these private schools,
Mm-hmm.
the big ones. Um, the final legislation protected, actually cut the number of private schools that can get public tuition dollars, but
Right.
very much protected the big boys. Um, so anyway, he was extremely influential. Usually, you have like the minority member on the House side,
Mm-hmm.
Representative Chris Taylor. I don't remember ever seeing him speak. Um, but there were Beck and Bongarts very much driving the conversation on the Senate side and basically forcing the House to come up with a proposal that would meet their approval.
Right.
Um, and what they were proposing was very different from what the Senate itself passed.
Yes.
So anyway, we're getting to keep on the Scott Beck trail here. Beck was extremely influential, more so than you would expect a minority member to be in the final negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
Part of this bill is setting up an 11-member task force that is supposed to propose new school district maps for the entire state and much larger districts generally
Yes.
than what we have now. This is a politically fraught, only in journalism word, effort. By December 1st, they are supposed to come up with up to 3 different maps for the legislature to consider next year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the most likely outcome in the legislature is that they will draw their own map anyway, but
But it's good to have a starting point.
11-member commission. The governor appoints one person. The House and Senate each appoint 5. From that 5, 3 of them can be sitting members of the House or Senate. Well, the Senate got to appoint 5. 3 of the 5 could be members of the Senate. The other 2 had to be former educators. There were certain ways
Mm,
of defining what that means: superintendents, district officials,
right.
whatever. Um, so um, the Senate announced its 5 members, and there was Scott Beck,
Back again.
uh, the only Republican from the Senate on this task force that will draw new district maps.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so he's again made his way to the front of the room, and
Mm-hmm.
he's again got a seat at a very small table. Um, so I just thought it was a remarkable run of success for a person who was very little known on a statewide stage until this year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's been an amazing session for him
Right.
personally, and as I wrote, I think that he has to be seriously considered as a potential Republican nominee for governor whenever Phil Scott decides to step aside.
Even ahead of the lieutenant governor?
I think so.
Okay.
I think Lieutenant Governor John Rogers has some big holes in his game.
Hmm.
Um, I think that he would have, because he's a former Democrat, I think if he were in a Republican primary, I think he would have trouble winning it.
Mm, mm-hmm.
If it was a
I see your
contested
point.
primary.
Yeah.
Scott Beck has very much, created an image, which, there's a lot of truth in it. Okay.
Yeah.
But I was talking about it as an image of a pretty orthodox Republican
Mm-hmm.
who will be a forceful advocate for Republican policies, who will be a successful advocate for and a persuasive advocate for Republican policies, but who has also amassed a record of working effectively with the Democrats when need be. Um, you know, I there's no way of predicting how statewide politics would play out. When there is an opening for the governorship, it tends to attract a lot of candidates and kind of dogpile primaries. My favorite of which, in my own experience watching politics in Vermont, is the 2010 Democratic race when Jim Douglas retired, and
Right.
five Democrats entered the primary.
Mm-hmm.
The final result was stunningly close.
Mm.
Peter Shumlin won with like 26% of the vote.
Yeah.
Doug Racine, the former lieutenant governor, former human services secretary, was like 2 percentage points behind him.
It
Point.
was close. Yeah.
And there were two other candidates, Gay Symington and Matt Dunn, who were above 20%.
Mm-hmm.
The fifth person was, single digits, not much of a factor, but that was a wild and very unpredictable primary, uh, razor thin outcome. And, the next time, whenever Governor Scott decides to step aside, I would expect that there will be a highly competitive Democratic primary and probably a competitive Republican primary.
Mm-hmm.
And, if it's John Rogers, the former Democrat, against someone, the former Democrat who has been vocally opposed to Donald Trump. And he's in a primary against a longtime Republican who has not been vocally opposed to Donald Trump.
Hmm.
I think he would have trouble winning a primary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I I would have to see more from John Rogers to take him uh, seriously as a future governor of Vermont. Um, I've been wrong about this before. My track record in predicting who's going to come to the top of the political pile, good. But if Las Vegas were setting the odds or the sports books were setting the odds on the Vermont gubernatorial race in 2028 or whenever, um, and Scott Beck was a long odds, long shot, I'd put down a few bucks on him.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put it that way. I think what he's done in the last 6 months is extremely impressive.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most impressive runs of success for a single political figure in the legislature I've seen in a long time.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that stands out to me in what you've just said is looking for the words, but what a way to keep a consistent narrative about the ed finance bill and where it should go.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been able to tell it over multiple phases. Um, and so it will be interesting to see which of Scott Beck's ideas or what he is pushing for make it over the finish line.
Yeah. And I think the education reform bill, which is now Act 73, has a long way to go before it ever takes effect. It would
Mm-hmm.
take effect in the year 2028, and it has to meet certain tests and get over certain obstacles, and uh, hit certain guidelines and benchmarks in order to roll into effect.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot that needs to happen between now and then. And people are already saying that next year's debate over the next phase of education reform will be at least as contentious as this year's.
Yay.
And it will be taking place in an election year. And, if this bill in its current form or something like it were to take effect, it would probably result in the closing of a lot of small rural schools.
Mm-hmm.
Places like Scott Beck's district would be hit pretty badly.
Good point.
Um, and he would need to use his political skill to try to explain that to his constituents and try to explain that to a broader electorate that might be suffering some real shocks from this reform taking effect.
Mm-hmm.
The loss of a lot of local governance, local control over school policy and school budgets. Um, fewer schools, especially in rural areas. So, um, this is the beginning of the effort, and it's way too early, but it's my job to talk about politics and the next cycle and the next governor, whenever that happens.
Yep.
And I think, uh, there is an upward arrow next to Scott Beck's name in the charts.
Thank you, John. Unfortunately, we are out of time here on the happy hour, but we have just a few minutes left, or not a few minutes, just under a minute left. And I don't think it would be fair to listeners to head out without hearing just a little bit about your thoughts on a recent visit to LA.
I was in Los Angeles in early May for a week, and it was a really neat experience in many ways. At one point, I found myself in MacArthur Park, partly, honestly, because of the song. I just wanted to see it. It's a kind of a nondescript city park.
Mhm.
But then to see that and to see a lively neighborhood around it that was not without its problems, but it's a neighborhood gathering point. And then to see the pictures of the ICE troops, barging through this peaceful park for no good reason.
Mhm.
They didn't arrest anybody. There was no crime to be prevented. There wasn't even a protest to kick people around. They just marched through the park and left. They didn't arrest anybody. They didn't detain anybody. It was a show of force.
They probably scared a lot of people.
Yeah, this is one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And I'm sure that's not a coincidence. So, to see those pictures in a place that I had just been to made it real to me in a
Hmm.
way that's, if it's just some place somewhere else far away, it's not. And then, to be reading about the big bill that Trump just signed into law that's going to vastly increase the amount of money for border enforcement. It's going to, like, ICE is going to be able to, like, at least close to triple its enforcement force. It's going to be a lot more detention centers operated by for-profit companies like CoreCivic. Uh, it's just going to be much more intense. It's going to be the biggest, by far, the biggest sort of law enforcement agency in the federal government. And the way Trump has used ICE so far, it's going to get a lot worse. It's going to get a lot more widespread. Um, you think that farm workers in Vermont are worried about just like driving to the store? Um, it's going to be worse. Is he going to start sending ICE troops in, battle regalia and face masks to the UVM campus to break up a protest or round up international students? I have to think that that's a very real possibility. Are we going to see ICE forces? ICE has arrested people at court hearings, at immigration hearings, at other official places. Are we going to see heavily armed, identity concealed ICE troops at polling places in November of 2026? I think we will.
Hmm.
Not everywhere, probably in ethnically diverse precincts in swing districts. That's going to intimidate a lot of people from voting. If it suppresses Democratic turnout by a few percentage points, might help the Republicans keep control of the federal government. Um, that's what we're facing. We are facing a dramatic expansion of a police apparatus that is already being used by Trump to intimidate, to especially intimidate people of color, um, to spread fear and confusion, um, and the the immigration and border enforcement apparatus that he has been able to use at his whim is about to get far, far larger.
Hmm.
And I think that's a real warning sign for, honestly, for the future of democracy in our country.
Yeah.
There's
Reading,
a nice note to end on.
well, and I'll end it on an even more fun one. Reading your piece this morning brought up two things for me. The first was an interview I did with Mayor Lott from Winooski, and just the tone of her voice when we were talking about um, her community and their concerns right now with ICE. You know, she said, and I'm paraphrasing, we want a safe community and we're working very hard to have a safe community in Winooski, but you know, we can't guarantee it now
Mm,
under what's happening at the federal level. And that just was gut wrenching. And it really brought home many of the things she's dealing with. But then right after I had that conversation, I was visiting friends in Keene and we went to a Mexican restaurant and they were playing music in the background, like a lot of restaurants do. And all of a sudden, Christine Christine Noem's voice came on, basically saying, "We want you to deport yourselves, and if you don't, we'll find you." Basically, was what the message was. And so, I encourage anyone who regularly streams music from Spotify, because I think they use Spotify at this restaurant, or Pandora, or any of those streaming services. Listen, are you hearing these commercials? And I'm betting if you're not listening to like a Spanish language channel or, you know, another language channel besides English, you're probably not hearing these commercials. And they
no,
were, it was pretty upsetting, you know, and we're not the target demographic, my friends and I.
no,
But I just, it stands out for me how at this point things are still feeling like bubbled.
mhm,
But we need to be careful because they won't stay bubbled for long.
no,
And it will be your neighbor or it will be your family member who
yep,
is in danger,
yep.
if not you yourself. So, how's that for a happy note?
Yes. Have a good day.
Good luck, everyone. Yeah, in all seriousness, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. The Montpelier Happy Hour is on Friday at 2 p.m. on WVEW LP Brattleboro. You can find John's work at the Vermont at the VPO.org. And take care. And I hope you all have a good weekend.